Welcome to Cyber Masterminds. I am Ryan Riel, and today we'll be talking with Charles Carmakal. Charles is a Senior Vice President and Strategic Services CTO at Mandiant, the incident response arm of the cybersecurity company FireEye. Charles and his team have helped hundreds of organizations respond to major security breaches orchestrated by foreign governments, criminals, and many others. Charles has almost 2 decades of significant experience helping Fortune 500 companies build and enhance security programs to combat advanced attacks. Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. And we'll just get right off the bat, kind of, if you wouldn't mind explaining what it is you do and a brief overview of your work.
Yeah, so really there's 2 main things that I do. So I lead a team of folks that help organizations respond to incidents. So typically when foreign governments or organized criminal groups break into organizations, we do investigative work to figure out how do they actually break in. And then we try to find ways in order to contain the incident and eradicate threat actors. The second main thing that we do is we try to take all the learnings from the hundreds of breaches that we respond to help organizations become more resilient to attacks. And so if we know how the bad guys break into organizations and steal data and remain undetected for weeks or days or years, we could take those learnings to help other organizations build capabilities to better detect attacks and respond to them more quickly.
Okay. And where you are now, you are leading this group and you work with so many people and with really high profile cases. Is this something you always ascribe to do? Is this something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, so I got into security in middle school. I did a lot of vulnerability research and exploit code development, and honestly, it was a really fun, probably obsessive and very unhealthy hobby of mine. And all throughout middle school and high school, but pretty much after school, I would just get on my computer and I'd geek it out. And I learned a lot, but at the time, it was just kind of a fun thing for me. I didn't actually think there were real careers in cybersecurity. I ended up going to the University of Florida, and when I went to school there, I actually thought, you know what, I thought there were going to be, I wasn't too interested in taking on a technology job. And so when I decided my major, I decided, you know what, I like technology, but I'd rather be focused on business. So I ended up doing a degree in kind of computer engineering and business. And I was probably more interested in the computer engineering side, but I thought there were probably more career opportunities from a business perspective. Then the second year that I was at university, I heard a presentation from PricewaterhouseCoopers. They were talking about how they were trying to build out this ethical hacking business. And I remember thinking, holy crap, you get paid money to hack into companies and you won't go to jail. I mean, this is exactly what I want to do when I grow up. But if you looked at my resume at the time, it looked like a guy that wanted to be an investment banker. It didn't look like a cybersecurity professional. And so what I had to do over the next few years in my undergrad program, as well as in my master's program, was prove to an employer that I was very serious about taking on a security job. And this was in the early 2000s, and they weren't really hiring a lot of security professionals straight out of school. And at the time, they were more interested in finding folks that had computer engineering backgrounds that might have been working for a few years, and then try to turn them into security professionals. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to become a security professional immediately out of school. And it was challenging, to be quite honest. But I ended up getting an internship at PwC, and I had a pretty broad range of engagements that I worked on. But one of them was an ethical hacking engagement for a government entity. I remember doing that engagement, and it was such a basic type of attack, but I was able to compromise their Novell network environment. And I remember as a 20-some-odd-year-old guy walking out of this government building that day, I had the biggest smile on my face that I could not get off of me. I remember thinking, holy crap, I just hacked into a government entity. In hindsight, probably not that big of a deal, but at the time I was like, this is incredible. And they want me to do this, and this is going to help them get more secure. And this is what I want to do when I graduate from school. And so that's kind of how I got into this, and been at it ever since.
That's really interesting, and I want to chase the thread a little bit further, because when we do these talks, some of our guests have talked about how helpful help desk experience was, or system administration, or entrepreneurial stuff before they really went full bore into cybersecurity. How did the kind of investment banking background or studies translate and help you in your cybersecurity role and where you are today?
So I think it helps me right now with respect to the business acumen that I need in order to run a business. And so, while I like to stay as close to the technology and as close to the technical investigative things that we're doing as a company, at the end of the day, we're running a business, and we have to continue to grow the organization. So my experience in business, I think it's helped me really grow a pretty mature security consulting practice.
Okay, and I would like to, if you don't mind, a little bit from that 20-something a guy who hacked into a government organization, broke the Novell network, to where you are now. How did you achieve that goal? And did you have a plan, or did you just keep working? Or
so when I was at PwC, I was really focused. Okay, so what really excited me was doing technical security work, and I wanted to do as much ethical hacking and red teaming as I possibly could, because that was fun, it was exciting. But at the same time, I recognized that I wasn't going to get promoted if I was just delivering, or rather, I wasn't going to get promoted quickly if I was just delivering these technical pen testing and red teaming engagements. And so I had to do things that were larger in scale and more significant and more impactful to our clients. And so I started doing a lot of enterprise-wide security assessment work and strategy work that were larger in terms of dollars. And because I was doing these larger scale engagements at PwC, they recognized me for the revenue that I was bringing in, as well as my technical expertise. And so I went through a number of iterations of promotions relatively quickly at the firm. And the firm was great to me. And after about 7.5, 8 years or so, they asked me if I would relocate to Australia to help them build out a security consulting business. And to be quite frank, at the time, I wasn't that interested in moving out there, and they were probably selling me on all the things that weren't too exciting to me. They were selling me on the lifestyle out there and the beaches and all that. And honestly, that didn't really excite me that much, because I had a lot of what I liked from a personal perspective in the United States. But as I started talking to a bunch of friends that ended up relocating to other parts of the world, I had folks that were partners at big four firms, and they went to Singapore or Japan or Australia or various other places. They told me that they were able to do things they would have never been able to do in the U.S. and help catapult their career to the next level. And I remember thinking, wow, I really could do some things in Australia that I could never do in the U.S. And so I ended up moving out there and led a security consulting practice and hired a number of folks. And really, we're very mission oriented. I was really trying to help organizations get better at security and better protect themselves. And I was trying to create this environment for the team to learn and grow and to do things that they may not be able to do elsewhere. So I had an incredibly loyal and incredibly talented group of folks that were behind me. And they did some pretty amazing things, and I was able to be the beneficiary behind that. Now, the challenge, though, is running a practice is you can't necessarily get that deep in any particular area. You have to run an entire practice, and anything that's a security discipline that the company offers to our clients is something that you have to become experienced in. And so while you have a pretty broad breadth of security experience and expertise, it's sometimes hard to dive in deep into a particular area. And one of the areas that I was really interested in was incident response. But I was interested in that mostly because I was really fascinated with offensive security, and I wanted to become the best offensive security guy out there, or at least from my perspective. And so I had a lot of friends that worked at Mandiant, and I made the decision to have a serious conversation with Mandiant and potentially join them. And I talked to a bunch of buddies that I knew that used to work with me at PwC that at the time worked at Mandiant, and I heard some of the things that they were doing on a day-to-day basis, and I remember thinking, wow, I really want to be part of that. And so I ended up going through a few rounds of interviews with the Mandiant folks, and they ended up extending me an offer. And I joined Mandiant at the end of 2011. And at the time, the company was a very different company than it is today. We had about 42 consultants on the team. We mostly operated out of a single country. I mean, we did incident response work all over the globe, but most of the team was based in the United States. And for the most part, we almost exclusively did incident response work. We did pockets of other types of work, but we were really the company that did incident response work. And so it was good because we got a lot of depth in that area. But it was bad that we didn't have the opportunity to really help our clients much more broadly than that. And over the years, we ended up building out some new capabilities to do a few things. One, help companies respond to breaches, but two, And maybe more importantly, let's help them not become a victim, and let's help them, mitigate the risk of actually getting compromised. And we're not saying that we're going to, we help organizations completely eliminate breaches, because breaches will probably inevitably happen, but we could help minimize the impact and the risk of breaches. And we could help organizations detect an intrusion, hopefully earlier on in the attack lifecycle, such that the attackers don't have the ability to steal data or to meet their objectives. So that's where we are, and that's how I got here.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And I want to follow up with a couple of things, particularly though, moving to Australia, changing your field, pushing your reports to your team to do new things. It sounds like a lot of what you did, was getting out of your comfort zone a little bit. And I would like to know more about that and how that helped you, get to where you are right now.
Yeah, look, you've always got to operate a certain amount of outside of your comfort zone. I tend to try to operate maybe, 40-ish% outside of my comfort zone and stay about 60% in the comfort zone. Because what that does is allows you to focus on the things that you're good at, but also stretch yourself. And that allows you to gain a lot of new experiences, probably at an accelerator rate than what you might be able to do otherwise. And so, look, there are a lot of things that I did that I was probably nervous about and scared about. And in fact, there are a few times where, a few times in my career where I thought maybe I pushed myself too far. Maybe I was, 40% in my comfort zone and 60% outside of it. And look, I'll tell you, there was one time when I was in Australia, I had set some pretty ambitious revenue goals for the team, and we were missing our numbers for the first several months. And I remember just really stressing out about that. So when I take a shower, I notice hair in my hands. I was like, crap, I'm too young to start balding right now, and I don't got the right shaped head to look good as a bald guy. So I got to find a way to keep this hair on my head. And look, it was a combination of luck and timing, but having a incredibly loyal team behind me and having some great clients. And after a few months, we were able to pick up some pretty large engagements and get back on track and start to really exceed the revenue expectations that we had. And my hair started growing back. I don't have any hair loss issues right now, so I feel pretty good about that.
You look great. So yeah,
Thanks.
It's clearly working for you.
I just wanted to hear that.
Anytime. So you work with all sorts of different companies, and I'm curious as to kind of the range and what you've seen change over, because this is such a fast moving field, over the last 5-10 years, through the work that you've done.
Yeah. Look, there's there've been a lot of changes. Probably one of the more notable changes right now is that we see a lot of organizations trying to move their data centers to cloud environments, and so kind of leveraging some of the bigger players out there, for probably scaling purposes, maybe some cost purposes, things like that, which also introduces some new challenges. And part of the challenge is there's sometimes a perception that there is no security exposure, security liability if you move infrastructure and data over to the cloud, because somebody else is responsible for it. And what some organizations sometimes fail to realize is, at the end of the day, the accountability really lies on the person or the organization that ends up owning the data. And even if there truly is a shift in liability, where contractually you can make somebody else obligated for protecting the data, you got to think about what's the headline of the Wall Street Journal going to say. It's not going to say that this small company lost data. They're usually going to say, the big name, the data owner was the ones that actually lost the information. And so, you got to think about that. So that's probably, one of the bigger challenges that we're seeing. The next challenge is, or the next change is really the change in the geopolitical landscape. There are a lot of intrusions that we respond to that are politically motivated. They may have something to do with sanctions or with certain political statements or perceptions of certain countries, or maybe it's just purely based on the need and the desire to accumulate knowledge and wealth of information, and so it's just as an example with the current political climate. With Iran right now, there's a big fear about what kind of retaliation will Iran do. And it's actually pretty interesting to see that we haven't actually seen any real attacks yet from a cyber perspective since the major event that happened a few days back. But leading up to that, and completely unrelated to that, we saw a lot of offensive operations by Iranian operators. And so again, it's really interesting to see how the political climate impacts us from a cyber perspective.
Definitely. And you talked about the headline that you see in the paper or on TV. You do a lot of work talking to those media outlets, and I'd like to know a little bit more about that and kind of how you see your role as somebody who's able to kind of take the complex and the scary and maybe translate it to an audience that's not so familiar with that.
Yeah. Look, there are a lot of cybersecurity journalists out there. Some are great, and they try to get the facts. They try not to create too much fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But there are some others that may not quite understand the message, or maybe they want to create some fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and create the big headlines. And I've got a relationship with a lot of journalists, and I end up trying to coach them as best as I can as to what am I actually seeing, what's real. And there are times where I see a story written about a particular topic or a theme where I could sometimes tell that maybe they got a data point wrong. So, for example, a specific example. So there's a journalist of mine, a journalist friend of mine that wrote a story about a specific threat actor, and he got the name of the threat actor wrong. But I was able to tell based on the description of what he was writing about, he meant to talk about a different threat actor. So it's just a friendly tip to him. I hit him up and I said, hey, I think you named a group Fin 5. You meant to call him Fin 6. I know it's easy to confuse the two. I don't want to make him look bad, but at the same time, I want to make sure that he's got good information out there. So he'll update stories. I tend to get approached by a lot of journalists about things that I'm able to talk about. Now, there are a lot of things I can't talk about. So if there is a particular intrusion of a specific organization, I'm not talking about it. But if there are themes in terms of, there are a lot of, say, for example, intrusions going on right now in the automobile manufacturing sector, I can have conversations about that because I'm not going to break any non-disclosure agreements. And so I will have a lot of conversations about the trends that I'm seeing, or maybe have conversations about the threat actors that I'm seeing behind some of these intrusions. And the goal is to try to share factual information with journalists so that they report well. And they don't create an unnecessary amount of buzz when maybe there shouldn't be an unnecessary amount of buzz.
Have you seen a change we talked about the kind of landscape in the past 5 to 10 years, but have you seen a change in maybe the media or the general public in terms of awareness or protocol or practices maybe?
Yeah. So look, it's hard to go an entire week without seeing a data breach story in the headlines.
Sure.
And we've become a little bit numb to it. So as the general public hears about data breaches, a very common response is, oh, well, they've already got my data anyway. What,
sure.
I get another free year of credit monitoring or so. And so I sometimes see now some people don't care about the data breach disclosures because it's just yet another one. And there's a little bit of cynicism around companies' abilities to secure data. So that's probably one of the kind of the bigger themes that I'm noticing from an overall just general public perspective. Now, I definitely see for organizations that people maybe care about more, maybe they're a more household name when they get breached. I sometimes feel hear about maybe an unfair treatment to those victim organizations, and we also need to recognize that these are victim organizations, and it's actually sometimes strange to know that there's a lot of victim shaming that goes on, and we penalize the organization that was a victim of a crime, and we probably wouldn't judge somebody negatively if they got robbed when they were walking on the street because they're a victim. We probably actually sympathize with them, but from a cybersecurity perspective, we sometimes tend to victimize or villainize the victims, and we say, hey, they didn't do what they needed to do to protect our data. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes maybe they should have done more. But I sometimes see some very unrealistic expectations of what organizations need to do to protect data. And I sometimes find that, almost always, no matter how quickly the victim organization publicizes the intrusion or the incident to the public, most of the times the public will say, why did they take so long? Even if it took them 30 minutes to notify. Why didn't they notify me 5 minutes after it happened? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but just want to emphasize that I very rarely see the public saying, wow, these guys did it quickly, they did the right thing, and congratulations. Because usually there's a set amount of emotions, and they tend to want to villainize the victim.
So when you're doing incident response or forensics and investigating these, is there, how much of that do you impart your wisdom or advice with? Okay, this is important, and in the future, this is what maybe some PR, some messaging.
Yeah. So
to that.
Yeah, when we do incident response work, I mean, we try to be as full service of an IR firm as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding we're not legal experts, we're not necessarily PR experts, we're not, we don't run call centers for people,
Sure.
But we truly do try to provide executive level guidance about all the things that may come out of an incident. And so, for example, if there is for example, an extortion matter where the threat actor is asking for a certain amount of money in exchange for not publicizing data. We'll talk to the client. We'll walk through the pros and cons of engaging the threat actor and or paying it. We'll list, what are the questions, what are the considerations, and by the way, what's our experience in dealing with this? So, for example, for organizations in a similar position that have made a payment, how often are they getting their data back versus when they're not getting their data back or data gets published on the internet anyway. We also try to coach our clients through things like how do they engage the media about it. Should they do a press release? Should they, just do a notification to impacted individuals? And again, we're not trying to provide legal guidance, but we want to provide just our experience about we've done hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of investigations. These are the things that we've seen. These are the things that we've seen work. And these are the things that we've seen not work. And we want to share that knowledge with our clients. And so, it definitely extends well beyond the technical bits and bytes of the forensic analysis and malware analysis. We also talk about government inquiries, right? And how do you anticipate that? Because look, if you're dealing with a major intrusion in your household name and personal information was exposed, there's a chance that there might be government inquiries. You might have to give testimony, for Congress or a congressional subcommittee. And so, again, we've got a lot of experience dealing with that, and our clients trust us to give them information about our experiences.
Okay. So, you're talking to media, you're talking to your customers, you're talking to your team. For somebody watching this who's excellent at the technical parts and the bits and bytes like you're talking about, how important is communication and working on those skills and making that really a strength for somebody in the cybersecurity field?
Yeah. Look, it is important, but I don't want to overemphasize it to the point where I would say that it's detrimental if you don't have good or great communication skills. Okay. I work with some, from my client perspective, I've worked with some incredibly talented technical folks that are insanely brilliant from a technical perspective, but they're introverts and they don't want to. They're uncomfortable verbalizing information and sharing it. If they can somehow share it and get that information across to people, to folks that can articulate it better, verbally or in written format, then that's probably what makes the most sense. So you can't just have a bunch of people that don't have any communication skills but have exceptional technical skills. There have to be some folks that have good communication skills. And ideally, look, I'd love for people to improve their communication skills as best as they can because that's so important. But I would say at a minimum, you need to pair up the folks that have poor communication skills with those that have great communication skills or good communication skills, and then you should hopefully be able to do what you're actually striving to do. Sometimes, if from an investigative perspective, you may be able to figure out everything that occurred from an investigative perspective, or you may be able to dissect malware and figure out exactly what the malware is actually doing. But if you can't communicate it to the people that need to know about it, then they're obviously going to run into some issues, and you're not going to get the recognition of being able to actually help clients solve the problems. But again, don't want to overemphasize the communication because I do recognize some people will not be able to improve upon it. But to the extent that they can try, great, do as best as you can. But at least at a minimum, partner up with folks that have good communication skills and also understand enough of the technical work.
Sure. And I love that. And I love coming from somebody who makes, hiring decisions and has worked with a lot of different people over the years. Yep. When you are, looking at somebody to bring on, or you're deciding between people or interviewing, kind of what sticks out for you and what can really set somebody apart.
Yeah. So it depends on where we're hiring them from. If we're hiring them from university, it's very different than if I hire them after, they've worked in an industry for 5 years. So let me talk about university hiring. I don't expect folks in schools to have years of experience already working in security. What I would expect for them is them to demonstrate to me that they love cybersecurity and this is a passion for them. So I look for passion, look for drive, I look for technical aptitude. I look for as best of a fit into our culture as we can. Not everybody wants to be a consultant, right? Because being a consultant, you tend to have, you live into this very dynamic environment where you have lots of bosses, lots of competing priorities. And by lots of bosses, I mean, you have a lot of clients and each one of your clients is essentially your boss because they're asking you to do certain things or they place certain demands on you. And so, not everybody wants to be a part of an environment like that. But I find that people that have the technical aptitude, and by the way, sometimes technical aptitude is hard to assess. You just get to understand that they're a smart person, they're analytical, and typically people that are smart and analytical and have a drive and a passion for security tend to do really well in security. And another way to maybe illustrate passion as well as like real interest in security is people. They work on security projects on the side. They build tools. They do research projects, and they do it because it's fun for them. It's not because somebody told them to do it. And I definitely look for that. I'm personally very focused on finding talent from universities because that's what's a great opportunity to create great opportunities for those folks. But at the same time, it also helps our company continue to grow and scale. And those are those are going to be the next generation in the future of our company. And so I'm really eager to find folks from university. For folks that are experienced, and let's just say, for example, they've worked in a consulting shop, they've done incident response work before. We'll try to assess how well do they do incident response work, how much do they know, how much skills and experience are they actually bringing to the table, as well as how good of a fit are they in the organization. And, again, the level of scrutiny is probably going to be higher for experienced folks that are interviewing. But one thing that I always will look at is, am I also looking at somebody that has good technical aptitude, but may not have had the best opportunity to learn a lot about incident response in the right way? And without naming any names or shaming any organizations, I distinctly recall hiring a guy that I could tell was highly, highly intelligent. I was able to tell that he had incredible technical aptitude, but he wasn't the best investigator. And I don't believe he was a good investigator because, and by the way, at the time, he wasn't the best investigator. I could tell it was probably because of the organization that he was in. He was probably the best there. He just didn't have the chance to learn from anybody else. And by the way, I was pretty frank with him. I told him, I don't think you're a good investigator today, but I think you are incredibly smart and you have the potential to become an incredible investigator. And it's funny because I wanted to be transparent with him. I wasn't necessarily trying to necessarily motivate him to become the best person out there. I just wanted to be frank. And what I ended up doing was it probably put a chip on his shoulder for the first 6 months after he joined us. And his mission in life was probably to prove me wrong and to make me feel like he was a great investigator. And I'll still say it today. He wasn't good when we hired him. He was smart. He wasn't good when he hired him. He is an incredible investigator today. And it's because he surrounded himself by really smart people and he learned really good techniques to investigate. And he had the passion and the drive, and he spent so much time on his own just bettering himself and building new tools and capabilities. And I'd argue he's probably one of the best ones in the industry today. And I just largely think that's because he surrounded himself by exceptionally talented people.
Wow. Okay. Wow. So if you had some advice to give, people, you kind of talked about the university aspect of people starting out in the field versus people who've been around, but is there a piece of advice that you would really recommend to somebody who's really trying to better themselves in cybersecurity? Yeah.
So, look, and maybe this will be advice for folks that are just kind of starting their careers off. There are two books that I really like. There's the Hacking Exposed book, and then there's the Incident Response book. So Hacking Exposed was written by some former Foundstone, McAfee folks, and the Incident Response book was written by Mandiant folks. And I tend to find that there's, generally speaking, maybe two categories of people. There's the red team people and the blue team people in security. And of course, there's lots of other types of people, but in general, there's maybe two broad categories. Sorry, I need to turn the phone off. Two broad categories of people. And some people are really interested in offensive security. Some people are really interested in defensive security. So pick one that you want and then get the corresponding book. When I was young and I was starting off my career, I was really interested in offensive security. And so the Hacking Exposed book was outstanding for me. And one thing that I loved doing was I loved reading it and then learning about new tools or new capabilities or processes, and then testing it out in my own lab environment. And I set up VMware infrastructure and got lots of different systems set up. And I was basically just hacking my own network and learning how tools work. But I was more than just running tools. It was trying to figure out how are the tools working, why are they working, why are they doing things like this. I learned a lot. And so when I talk to folks from universities, I tell them, get these 2 books, one of the 2, whichever one you're more interested in, and then test out your skills and practice it. Because it's one thing reading it in a book, and it's another thing trying to apply it. And I do recognize that you're never going to be able to set up a test environment that looks like a corporate network. That's okay. Get some of the skills and demonstrate to a potential employer that you're really serious about this, and then you'll have the chance to really learn and practice in a corporate or government environment. And for folks that are maybe already in the game, try to learn as much as you can. I personally like hearing about what were the intrusions that occurred, and how did the bad guys actually break into the network? How did they go undetected for so long? What are the learnings from that? And it's not always easy to get that information because people tend to hold that pretty closely to the organization. But to the extent possible, try to get those learnings. Try to understand as much as you can. Do the research on your own, and then that will help you better your knowledge of security controls and why security controls exist, and it'll help individuals better protect organizations.
Okay, you talked about some of this early on, but I would love to know kind of what your biggest challenges are right now in your role.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's managing my work life with my personal life. So I've got 2 young kids at home, and so I've got to be a good father. I've got to be a good husband. I've got to be a good leader at an organization. And it's sometimes really difficult to play all 3 roles. I think I'm doing a pretty good job of 2 roles. I'm not going to tell you which 2, but I could probably do a better job of that 3rd role. And it's just, honestly, the challenge is balancing it all together. And as I continue to progress in my career, I take on new responsibilities, and it sometimes becomes difficult juggling everything that you have going on.
Sure. Yeah, I can totally see that, especially as you like you said, as you advance and having to figure that out. So is there, I'm curious, you mentioned, as a leader, your role as a leader in this organization, what kind of leader do you, would you describe yourself as? What's your leadership style?
So so when I was in my 20s and I was running PwC security consulting business, I remember thinking, in order for me to become the best leader out there, I needed to get as many accolades as possible. I needed to accomplish as much as I could. It's all about how much revenue could I bring into the company, how many people could I hire, how many clients could I help. It was a very, honestly, it was a very Charles-focused, selfish view of becoming a leader, and I thought that was normal. I didn't think anything of it. But I had and by the way, I did really care about my team, but at the same time, I felt like, in order for me to really help my team, I needed to help myself, and then I would be in a position to help my team out. And I had my mentor at the time. He told me, he said, Charles, for you to become a leader, it's not about your accomplishments and your accolades. It's about creating a team of leaders that then in turn create a team of leaders. Mm-hmm. And the point behind his message was, stop focusing on yourself, start focusing on everybody else. And as you promote other people, as you create these new opportunities for other people, and they do the same thing for their team, it's not going to be a competition for you guys. They will naturally be loyal to you, and they're going to elevate you. So you're going to be the natural beneficiary of their success. And so, the way I try to do things nowadays is I really took that to heart. I focus more on my team than I do on myself. And, look, I'm a lucky beneficiary, a very humble beneficiary of my team's success. Mm-hmm. But if I could create new opportunities for my team, if I could help them achieve their career objectives, if I could help them learn things that they maybe wouldn't learn elsewhere, and if I could create this environment where they have a good time, they learn, then hey, you know what? I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And we've got to balance that with being able to help our clients do things that they may not be able to do on their own. And so if you focus on your clients, you focus on your people, like everything else kind of falls into place. And so I don't know, maybe that's how I'd kind of describe me.
Yeah. Well, and everything you've talked about so far with, how you interact with clients or how you build a team or how you talk to the media and the relationship, it all comes down to relationships is what I'm teasing out a little bit. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I'd love to know about, it's tough though to try and balance all of that and make sure that those relationships are strong. And I'm curious, is that something you are cognizant of or aware of, or just, that comes with what you do?
Yeah, look, I've professionally been in the security game for about 20 years now. And I recognize that there's a lot of emphasis on relationships. And one of the things that I try to do to, establish good relationships with folks is really, I try to figure out what's in the best interest for our clients, as opposed to what's in the best interest for me or what's in the best interest for the company that I work for. And if you focus, if you prove to your clients that you're genuinely out there to help them, they're going to take care of you back. And so, look, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I've got lots of great relationships with a lot of senior level folks at organizations, and I tend to get a lot of phone calls from folks that need help, and that tends to translate into real dollars back into the company, which generally helps the team, helps, and it also helps our clients. And I always encourage my client or my team. One of the unique positions that we're in is, as we help organizations with with incident response engagements, our clients are in the most vulnerable position they've ever been in, sometimes in their entire lives, and they tend to look at us for advice, and they tend to want to do or will be willing to do anything we tell them to do. And with that with that power comes great responsibility. And I tell the team, look, you've got to be honest with our clients. You got to tell them the things that you genuinely believe are the right things to do for them, for their organization. Don't try to be selfish. Don't try to do things that'll help FireEye's bottom line. Do the things that are going to help our clients. And maybe it's recommending other technology companies' products and maybe services from other companies. That's okay. Let's do the right thing, because I guarantee you, if we are doing our job, and we're doing the things that we should be doing, our products will get better, our people will get better, our services will get better, our clients will want to pay for us, and they'll want our help. And generally speaking, our clients come back to us time and time again, to help them continuously improve their security program.
Okay, this is going to be kind of a tough one, but as in general terms, is there anything that you see coming down the pike on the horizon that somebody in their career, maybe young or experienced, should be like, maybe I should become more familiar with this, maybe I should work on this in the coming years? Yeah,
look, I mean cloud technology, microservices, containerization, things like that. Like, those are all kind of the new hot topics, things that that people are still kind of trying to figure out how do you address it from a security perspective. Because there are definitely a lot of differences and nuances to to dealing with security there, and we don't necessarily have an abundance of security professionals in the industry that know that well enough. And so it's good for folks to get as much exposure to that as they can, because it's definitely emerging, and it's not going anywhere.
Sure. And I like what you talked about earlier with the responsibilities and how the perceived responsibilities and the actual responsibilities of particularly when the data is not on-prem or that kind of as it's containerized. So definitely something to look into there. Are there any habits or practices for you that you find particularly useful in your day-to-day?
So I juggle a lot of things during the day, and I have to context switch a lot. And one of the things I try to do my best is I keep a pretty good log of all the things that I need to do. And I put it in Microsoft Excel. I categorize it by the due date, the topic area or the client that I'm working with, the task, and the status. The reason why I have a column for the topic area or the client is what I don't want to do is I don't want to work on a matter for a particular client, but in my head be thinking about a different client, and then respond to the wrong client with maybe information about a different client. And so I try to focus on, hey, for the next 15, 20 minutes, I'm only going to focus on client X and I'm going to do things for client X. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to focus on client Y. And so that helps with not confusing clients. And knock on wood, I have yet to confuse a client or send a document to the wrong organization. Which, look, it'll probably inevitably happen at some point in time, and I will beg for forgiveness when it does happen. But I am doing my absolute best so that it doesn't happen. The other thing is, I sometimes, when I start a task, I actually write it down on my to-do list because there's a good chance I'm not going to finish it. And the reason for that is because I tend to get a lot of distractions. So, for example, while we've been on the this Zoom meeting for the last 45 minutes, I've probably gotten 7 phone calls, and I'm looking in 2 different directions for 2 different phones that have been ringing, and I haven't even checked my email yet. And so, I think people, as they've walked by my desk, they've seen that I'm talking to somebody, so they haven't actually walked in and interrupted me. But the interruptions are they happen all the time, and they happen for the right reasons. But if I don't write down some of the things that I've started doing, or if it's not easy for me to know that I need to continue it, then I'll run into issues. And it doesn't really matter how many things you start. It matters how many things you finish. And so I want to finish as many of the things that I need to finish. And in order for me to be able to do that, I've got to do a pretty good job of keeping track of all the tasks that I have. And I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. When I look at my to-do list right now, it's about 450 lines deep. I don't have to get all those things done today, but those are things that I'm actively juggling and prioritizing and trying to get done, as I can get them done.
Okay. Well, we won't take up too much more of your time then. I know you're very busy, but is there anything else that you think people watching this should really know, or anything maybe we didn't cover? I was going to ask you about like recommendations or book recommendations, but you already covered that. So we're good there.
So, figure out whatever you're passionate about and whatever you're most interested in. And whatever you're most interested in, you will probably get really good at that. And ideally, people find a passion and an interest that will make them money and or will help them put food on the table. And for folks that are really interested in cybersecurity, try to learn as much as you can. Try to get as good as you can at it. And the more you learn, the better off you're going to be, and the better place that you'll be within an organization, and the more you'll be able to help them. So just again, find that passion. Security is not for everybody. And people, there are a lot of types of jobs out there that just become jobs, and it's okay to just have a job. That's fine. But if you find the passion for something, and if you could find a job that aligns with your passion, you're going to do incredibly well. And but the trick is to find what is that passion of yours.
Gotcha. Charles, is there anywhere people can find you or meet you at a conference or anything like that where they can see where you're going?
Sure. Yeah. So I do a lot of public speaking, speak at a lot of conferences. I'll be at RSA in February. I tend to go to Black Hat for a few days. I don't go to DEF CON as much anymore. I'm based in just outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia. So if they happen to be in the area, want to meet up, feel free to reach out. I don't know if you provide my contact details as part of this, but feel free to do that if you want. And I'm always happy to talk to anybody. And honestly, if it's fun for me, if I have a conversation with somebody that's trying to get into security, it's cool for me to find people that are excited about it. I love talking to folks, and I do my best to try to connect with folks that show interest.
Well, we appreciate you connecting with us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Charles Carmakal, thank you so much. For more talks like this and more information on how you can help your career in cybersecurity, visit cybermasterminds.com.